I'd like to begin by welcoming our guest today, our own VP of Sales and Marketing, Paul Bilodeau.
Thanks, Jeb. Glad to be here.
So today we're talking about selecting the highest performers. So I've got a question to put to you. What does it mean to be a high performer?
Well, in the world of sales, high performance really relates to that person who consistently exceeds expectations in the area of quota, in the area of margin, growth, account retention, etc. That person who has a fast ramp-up time and what I like to say doesn't leave a wake behind them in every sale.
What do you mean by wake?
Well, you know, where the sales manager or the sales VP has to go behind them and clean up the mess.
I gotcha. Have you ever seen that happen?
A few times, yes. Yes, I have.
So, Paul, you hear a lot of talk from sales leaders, and I know many of our listeners probably think a lot about the importance, the role of industry experience. You have a bit of a different take on that, so tell me what you mean when we're talking about industry experience.
Well, we often hear how it's so important to have industry experience. In our business is so different, and if you don't have industry experience, you're going to be lagging behind in performance. Now, what we see, though, is industry experience in a generic sense is one thing, but industry experience relative to your target market segments that you're trying to gain access to is something completely different. So what I see with our clients, and based on my experience over the years in sales and sales leadership, is if you're in a situation where you have a particular target market segment and you limit yourself to candidates that solely are reliable or reliant on sales industry experience or your generic industry experience, then you're missing the boat, because you may be able to have an individual who has access to your target market segment, an individual who has perhaps experience in that role of your target market segment, yet they don't necessarily have all of that generic industry experience that you typically look for. And let me give you an example. Let's say that you're in the print industry, and you've identified a target market segment as the investor relations departments of publicly traded companies. And what you're going after are those quarterly reports and those annual reports. If we are able to identify sales candidates that have experience and are very familiar with the world of investor relations in a publicly traded company, who understand the timelines and the deadlines that it takes in order to push these documents out, and all of the parameters around that, all the legalities around that, if you have that individual and you're able to provide them with that print knowledge, if you're able to provide them with even sales training, then you are in a situation now where that person has a greater chance of gaining access and gaining credibility faster than perhaps a more traditional salesperson. Does that make sense?
So what I'm hearing you say is that experience with the people you're after, the prospects, the decision makers in your given segment or marketplace is more important than just generic industry experience. So
yes,
let me feed back an example to make sure I understand. Let's say we're selling IT services to small and mid-sized companies. So rather than just hiring somebody who maybe understands how networks fit together and how switches talk to each other and all that kind of thing, you're better off looking for people who are comfortable with CEOs and presidents of those businesses.
Yeah, or perhaps somebody who really understands what it takes to run a small-sized business and all the stresses and anxieties that go with that, so they can speak to, you know, the stress and anxiety of meeting payroll on some of those months when the cash flow's down, and how capital costs up front are a real concern of theirs, and all of those, shall I say, emotional costs that perhaps if you have just generic industry experience, you don't necessarily understand the customer's perspective.
So it's all of that feeds into someone being the highest performer. It's not necessarily industry experience. It's not necessarily comfort with our industry. It's something more.
Right.
So, but experience has to play a role. So
yes.
What sorts of things should you focus on in your given candidate's background?
Well, when we're looking at industry experience, let's take a look a little bit further about the quality of that experience rather than the quantity. So somebody has 25 years of sales experience, yet in that 25 years it's been largely what we'll refer to as order taking in a strong market with a strong brand, then that person might not have the same skills to excel in your environment. So let's talk about strength of brand first. In terms of strength of brand, it's, we work with an organization called Target Training International, or TTI, and Bill Bonstetter, the founder of that organization, put together a great paper. And in that, he even mentions how a strong brand can actually carry a weak sales force. And let me give you an example. I worked with an oil services company for a number of years, and what we found is when we went after the large brand salesperson, so that person that comes from a very large brand in the oil services world, and we put them into our entrepreneurial environment where we are not widely recognized by the market yet, those individuals tend to struggle significantly. So alternatively, or conversely, what you have is somebody who is an average salesperson in a strong brand environment where the phone rings for them, and they don't really have to work too hard to get those appointments, and the customers feel if they don't answer the call and meet the rep with a strong brand company, they might be lagging behind themselves. So they're more receptive to meeting with you. Does that make sense?
That makes very good sense. So what else should we look at?
So the next is whether or not you're in a mature market or an immature market. So how familiar is your target market segment with your product line in general? Let's say, for example, you're selling a software that is fairly new to the business world in general. It's a fairly new concept. And it takes, again, a certain type of salesperson that is more familiar and experienced in that immature market environment rather than the person who is more experienced in a mature market. So we need to look at those things when we're investigating what the candidate's background really is.
Also, you were mentioning earlier the length of the sales cycle. In other words, if somebody's got experience with a short cycle, but you've got a longer one, it's not as useful to you.
It's not, and we've seen so many times where we bring on a salesperson who is just a rock star from their previous environment. They come into an environment where perhaps it's a very long sales cycle, and they quite frankly don't have the patience or the tolerance to deal with RFP process, with committees, with the negotiation process. And so they will get stifled and they'll get frustrated, and if they're not used to that environment, then they don't really excel. And then again, conversely, if you have an individual who is used to the long sales cycles, but they're in a more of a transactional environment with short sales cycles, those individuals, again, usually are not what I'll call aggressive enough or direct enough in that environment.
You talk a little bit about the technical nature of a sale.
Yes, yes. There are certain industries that will require a degree of shall I say, technical expertise. And if you can't speak to that technical expertise to your audience, your prospects, then you will lose credibility quite quickly. And to a degree, any company can provide that product knowledge. But when your service is so technical and it's so specialized, it's very difficult to overcome that. So again, dig deeper into that candidate's background. Let's find those technical salespeople who, again, have appreciation and a familiarity with our customers' stresses and anxieties so that we can build that credibility instantly.
Paul, this next area is one I know you're particularly interested in. In fact, we just completed, our listeners may enjoy knowing this, we just completed a paper with CSO Insights, a very well-respected sales research firm that we work with, on this topic. It's the distinction between a strategic sale and a more transactional one. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking at there.
Sure. So, I mean, many of our listeners, I'm sure, have heard the mentioning of strategic versus transactional. And really, strategic is that salesperson who looks at the bigger picture, who gets to the bottom of what the motivators and drivers are behind the buyer's decisions, or lack thereof. And the transactional salesperson is not necessarily an order taker, Jeb. They might be what I'll call an order seller as opposed to an order taker.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in other words, what they do is they have to still go out and fight for those orders, but they're still looking at one order here, one order there, as opposed to perhaps going a little higher in the organization and understanding how they can partner with that organization strategically to become their sole provider over, say, a 3-year agreement.
So regardless of sort of your offering out there, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I would think that almost every sales organization out there would really want to get to that strategic level, just because it helps people think, to use some of your terminology, beyond the order.
Yes, and we do use that term, thinking beyond the order. And if I took that example of the print company a little bit further here, having worked with various print firms out there, I've been in situations where I've seen a salesperson who was transactionally focused. They received an order for, say, $6,000 for one print job, but when I asked what the order was all about and what the customer was trying to accomplish by printing these documents, they couldn't answer me. They weren't understanding exactly what the motivators of the customer were. They didn't get to the bottom of why the customer was printing this or what it had to do with their business whatsoever. And so that is an example of a transactional salesperson. And then the strategic salesperson looks at the bigger picture, digs deeper, finds out that, in fact, where the opportunities are on a larger scale. So in other words, let's take the print example a little bit further. And then a strategic salesperson would go in there and look at the fact that quarterly reports are obviously printed how often?
Approximately once a quarter.
Very good. So, and then there's the annual reports. So if you look at the frequency there, you look at what goes behind that, what goes into that, and what the process is. Many organizations do not have a process, but yet a strategic salesperson would recognize if they show up with a process, then they're liable to continue to get those orders year to year and building a true partnership, whereas the transactional salesperson fights every quarter for that order, and it's usually based on price. Now let me say this because it's important. The transactional salesperson may still be required out there while you're transitioning your sales team to become more strategic. And we can't just flip a switch and automatically make all of our salespeople more strategic. That takes time. So it may be very important for your strategy long term to have a number of transactional salespeople so that the orders are still coming in and we're still getting cash flow and we're still able to meet payroll, keep the lights on, etc.
And to your point, Paul, if we can leave our listeners with this thought on this one point here, it's this. In our 35 years in this business, we've had the privilege of working with thousands of sales organizations across the world. And if there's one thing we leave the salespeople with, it's the idea of uncovering why somebody wants to buy from them. Why would somebody make a purchase? And that's right. That distinction in a nutshell.
Yes, and so to finish this point, Jeb, if we are out there looking for somebody who is more strategic in nature, then let's dig into their sales experience beyond just the number of years and find out where they have demonstrated where they've been strategic with their target market segments.
So let's look back at the candidate's background. There are a couple of other points here.
Yeah.
One is lead flow.
Yes.
What do you mean here?
Well, in terms of lead flow is if you have a sales candidate who is very, say, technical, who is very familiar with the background of their target market segments, understands their world intently, yet they are not wired in order to prospect effectively. In other words, it's a person who, once they're in front of the customer, will do exceptionally well. But to get them in front of the customer is quite challenging because they're just not wired to be, as we all term it, the hunter. Then what happens is you're in a situation where that person's going out there and they're asked to prospect, they're asked to generate leads, but it's just not in their DNA. And so if we don't have a strong marketing machine generating leads, then we're going to have a challenge with those people.
And this gives us an opportunity to plug the next in the series of 35-minute webinars, which will be talking about enabling your sales team to be more effective prospectors. So more on that to come. One final point. You say look at the distinction between account development and new account sales.
Yes, and so many of our audience, our listeners would say, oh, there's the farmer hunter. And you're right. The farmer is more about developing those existing accounts, and the hunter, again, going out there and getting access to those new accounts and developing those new accounts. And it really does take a different individual to do that, unless, of course, your marketing machine is such that it positions those excellent farmers to be pulled into those accounts.
But Paul, let's stop here. We've talked enough about experience. I think that we've kind of got a slightly different take on it now. But let's talk about what happens in the interviews.
Great.
You've been involved in some pretty bad interviews through the years, I'm sure. But what do you see that interviews don't necessarily give you?
Well, there's a lot of things that interviews won't provide. And what's interesting is there's a great stat out there by Michigan State University. And here's what they found, and I found this stat unbelievable. So 14% of hires that were made based solely on a favorable interview resulted in successful hires.
What was that?
Only 14%.
Oh, wow.
Which means that we need to do more than just rely on our interviewing skills. And there's a lot of things that we can do. Let's take a look at a few of these. Here's an example of what the interview won't provide you, all right? It's not going to provide you things such as this. Will the candidate be looking for another job within 6 to 12 months? And there's certain assessments and there's a certain process you can go through that will help to identify that. And here's another one. How coachable is this candidate? So will they be open to feedback and criticism, or do they feel that they have arrived at their ultimate self and there's nowhere for them to go?
And there's this fine line that you see in salespeople between confidence and arrogance. And that fine line, being on the right side of it, is critical. And sometimes it's, to your point, difficult to see that in an interview.
Absolutely. And so if you have that arrogance, we may perceive that in an interview in a toned-down fashion as confidence. And it's hidden a little bit deeper as to the fact that they are just not open to any coaching at all. Now, another point here is, and I've seen this so many times, where there's a certain type of individual that, again, you're not going to see this. They'll be very personal in an interview, yet when they get out there and they start selling, they have a lot of great wins on the front end, a lot of great sales at the front end, and then all of a sudden they die off. And it really is typical with people who have, ironically, industry experience, industry sales experience. And if we just look at that, we think this person is proven. Yes, it is proven. It's proven that they can sell to their friends and their loyal customers, but outside of that, they're lost. And so that's where you incorporate other best practices in selection, Jeb, and ensuring that you're not solely reliant on your interview. Here's a few more. Okay. How will they handle rejection or change or a lengthy sales cycle? Or what if you are a manager who's managing people from a distance and you won't have a lot of time with this individual in the field? What are their self-management skills like? How likely are they to hold price and hold margin? Or how likely are they to simply back down when they're challenged by a customer? And then here's another example is, will the candidate, and I mentioned this earlier, leave that wake behind them? Are you going to have a lot of cleaning up to do, like a bull in a china shop, after each of their sales?
And if there's one thing I've learned speaking with a lot of sales leaders out there, it's that you don't have time to do that cleanup. Instead, you need to be focused on other things.
Yeah, we like to say the last thing you need, Mr. VP of Sales or Mr. Sales Manager, is another project.
Exactly. Yes. So let's talk a little bit, Paul, if we could, about some best practices in selection. So what have you seen out there that our listeners could benefit from?
Okay. So in terms of best practices in selection, Jeb, let's just take a look at a few. Here's some obvious ones. And I already mentioned this. So let's look for quality and relevance in the resumes. Let's not limit ourselves to just that sales experience or just that industry experience. Let's dig deeper and look for that quality and relevance. Next is, whatever assessment you use, just choose one. Now, of course, yes, we have a line of assessments, but folks, the key here is we want to find an assessment that works for us, some kind of an online assessment that takes a look at personal skills and goes far beyond just behaviors, because it's more than just finding out whether they're an owl or a beaver or a monkey or whatever you want to call it. We need to dig a lot deeper than that.
And I recently saw a statistic, Paul. As many as 77% of organizations out there are using assessments in some capacity, and that's great. As you say, we've got one, but we really don't care what you use as long as you're using one because it gets you the information you need. If 14% of interview-based hiring decisions were successful, let's get that a little higher for you. So we encourage you to use something.
Absolutely. And here's another stat from Forbes magazine. This was an article last year where 40% of senior executives leave organizations because they are not a cultural fit within it. So how do you identify cultural fit from an interview? Sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. An assessment is just another piece that assists you with that. Now, let's take a look a little bit further. What I see when we're dealing with our clients and my experiences over the years in sales leadership role is not a lot of people truly understand how to properly conduct a behavioral interview. And so they'll use techniques such as, Jeb, in this environment, it's very fast-paced, and it requires a lot of energy. So, Jeb, do you have a lot of energy, and are you fast-paced?
I'm glad to hear you say that. I've often been criticized for being too fast-paced and too high energy.
Right, and that's the kind of answer you get. And so naturally, we feed them the answer during the interview process, or they come prepared with the job description in hand, and they just play the part of the job description. So what we need to do is we need to ask for the time where they truly demonstrated this. And give me an example of, give me a real-life story when this occurred. We want real-life stories to demonstrate that they truly possess this particular skill you're looking for.
And there's no doubt that some of the best people at interviews out there are salespeople.
Well, they can be, yes. Yeah, another big, I would say one of the bigger mistakes that you see managers make is they bring in a sales candidate and then they sell them on the job for half an hour. And then they read back their resume to them. And then they say, well, thank you very much. I can tell based on how you sit and how you look that you'd probably be good here. It needs to go beyond that. Now, the next one here is a panel interview, and we preach this over and over again. If you have more than just one pair of eyes and one pair of ears sitting in front of that individual, and you have a team approach to asking well-positioned interview questions that link to what it takes to be successful in the role, that is your best strategy for truly digging deep into whether or not this candidate possesses what you're looking for.
Paul, I'll share a point that one of my clients made to me recently about panel interviewing. She asked me, well, isn't that intimidating?
Yes. And the answer could be yes. However, in our sales environment, there's times where it can be intimidating, and there's times where multiple decision makers will be asking you questions. So we're looking for people who can handle those situations. Now, there's also, Jeb, I mentioned here, the fact that a scorecard and sample interview questions are highly recommended in terms of prepping everyone that's involved in that panel interview. Don't expect people to come in and wing it. You need to feed them the questions you want them to ask and provide them with that scorecard, Jeb, that allows them to keep track of those answers and the quality of the answers. Now, one more point on here that I'd like to make, Jeb, is checking references. All right? In terms of checking references, we want to make sure that we apply the same behavioral interviewing questions to this. Okay? When you're checking those references, I want to ask the reference the similar type questions of behavioral interviewing that I do of the candidate.
And that's so important because few of us would put bad references on our resumes. So we would certainly want to use those same skills, get that information, do it as look at it as kind of a version of a 360 on this candidate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I can't tell you how many times I've been given a friend or a relative as a reference, and I have used the approach of a behavioral interview only to discover that that friend actually gave me some very, shall I say, concerning reports around that individual's performance.
Some may say honest.
Well, there you go. And then lastly is, I'm sure most of the audience is aware of this, but the use of Google, LinkedIn, and Facebook as that last check as well.
Those are all certainly best practices in selection. What I'd like to do now, if we could, is open it up to questions and answers. We have about 10 minutes left, about 9 minutes left in our session today, and we certainly want to get to those, being very mindful of the time. But Paul, I've got one here right now from Dan in Colorado Springs. He's asking for a little bit more information about reference checks. He's asking if you have any advice there. We touched on it there at the end, but maybe you could share some more insight on that.
Well, it's Dan, is it?
Yeah, Dan from Colorado Springs.
Okay, well, Dan, again, just to reiterate the importance of incorporating behavioral interview questions into the reference checks, outside of just getting, a response of, well, yeah, Jeb seems to be a pretty good sales guy, and he seems to, his customers love him, and, gosh darn it, Jeb can be a really good prospector at times. And then I might follow up with, well, can you give me an example of when Jeb was able to successfully identify an opportunity himself, and then how he walked that through the sales process and ended up closing that business? And then there will be a pause. And then I'll ask, is there any example? And then you'll get, well, I'm not really sure if I've seen Jeb ever do that, but I'm sure he can. So, Jan, my recommendation is, again, let's make sure that we have those interview questions that are behaviorally focused. All right. Now, the second thing is, it's okay for you to look at those reference checks and ask for a few more if you're not comfortable with who they are. Find out what the relationship of the individuals are before you accept those as the be-all, end-all.
And do you have any suggestions on who we should ask?
Well, I mean,
what sorts of people would be beneficial to us as references?
Well, let's take a look at the resume, for example. Let's take a look at some customers that reflect your target market. All right. So if you have a specific market segment, let's call up, again, to keep that theme of the print company. Let's call up the investor relations department, and let's talk to somebody there about how familiar they are with the industry and how they think they would do in the area of sales within that industry.
Thank you very much. And we've got a question here from Melissa, and she's asking how can you tell if someone's going to be looking for a job in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, again, I mentioned the assessments, and there are a line of assessments that will speak to how that individual is currently viewing the world around them and how the individual is viewing themselves within that world. And there's certain indicators in an assessment like that that speak to their role awareness and their self-direction. And when we have role awareness in a lower category, we have self-direction in a lower category, that reflects an individual who's in a transition. Alternatively, if we look at the values of the individual through an assessment, we can identify that an individual may not be paid back from the job what they require in order to be satisfied in that job. So although they're behaviorally aligned with what it takes to be successful in a job, they're not motivated to do this for any length of period. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. And Tim is asking if we have any specific recommendations about assessments. We did say that that we recommend that you use an assessment. We have some. Do you have some thoughts on a best solution there?
My thoughts are this, folks. I mean, of course, we welcome you to check out our line of assessments, but this is not an infomercial. What I want you to do is make sure that the assessments that you do look for look at these three things. All right. Number one is behaviors, but an adapted behavior versus a natural style behavior. So how do they adapt on the job versus what their true natural style is? Of course, an individual who will be able to be more of their natural self in a role is more likely to be more productive and stay in that role for a longer period of time. The last is make sure you find something that looks at values or motivators of an individual. Those would be the keys.
Okay, Edgar here has another interesting question that really follows on to this point. And he's asking, Paul, if you've got an interview that goes really well and questionable assessment results, which one should weigh heavier? Which one should weigh more?
Okay, so an interviewer that is
an interview that goes very well, but the assessment results are a little bit sketchy, we'll say.
Yes. Okay, so it's Edgar. Here's how we handle that situation. And that happens daily with us and our clients. What we do is we have a great interview, and then we run the assessment, and it's somewhat suspect. All right. What we recommend you do is we formulate some questions that you could use in a second interview that help to validate whether or not the concerns in the assessment are real, or perhaps whether or not those concerns in the assessment are validated by a very a great explanation, based on their experience, based on what's occurring in their life right now. So you may see somebody who interviews well shows a low role awareness, but they're currently in a job that they just don't feel they fit in because their manager is new and they're more of an authoritarian and they don't work well in that environment. So that explains the low role awareness, and a well-positioned interview question will lead you down that path.
Great point. And I think you also answered Mike's question, who was asking about where you should put the assessment in the process. And what I heard you say is that it makes sense to narrow your candidates down, conduct that interview, potentially do the assessment, and then take a second look. Now,
absolutely.
One of the things I want to say thank you to, of course, is all of our participants who are sending us great questions. Now, we were not able to get to everybody's question, and so what I would like to do is let you know that we will be responding to those via email to you. So we'll make sure that we get those answers to you that way.
Can I answer one more question?
That's
jumped out at me, and that's that hunter question. All right. Is there a way to determine in an interview process a person who will have the hunter mentality yet is still committed to working with a team? And the short answer is yes. We can identify people who are more team sellers versus lone wolves, and that will speak to whether or not they are a hunter or a farmer. So,
great point. Thank you for bringing that up. And the last area that I wanted to touch in on in the Q&A section is we've had a number of questions about kind of technical things, whether we'll release the slide deck and when the audio will be available and all that. And the answer is very shortly. So you'll have access to the recording of this webinar very shortly. So if you missed anything, any of Paul's great insights, we will get those to you as quickly as possible.
I believe we're going to send out an email to these people advising them when that is ready.
That is exactly right. So keep an eye on your inbox within the next
48
hours.
2 days.
Yeah,
2 days. Okay, great.
So we'll have that out to you. But certainly do appreciate all of your insight, Paul. This was really fabulous.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Two more quick points before we say goodbye. Number one, I want to make sure that you tune in on May the 3rd, 2012, same time, same place, 12:55 p.m. to 1:30 for our second sales leadership webinar. We talked a little bit about this one earlier, which is enabling sales prospecting. We can get the greatest candidates in the world, but if they're not prospecting, and that's something that's important in your environment, they're not doing us much good. So what we want to do in that webinar is really dig into the idea of where your salespeople need to be, where they need to be focusing in order to accomplish those goals. So tune in there. More information to come.
And Jeb, another point on that is also focusing on what managers can specifically do to enable sales prospecting.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great. So with that, I'd welcome your comments and questions via email. You can see our contact information up there, and we'll be happy to, as I said, respond to any of those questions we didn't get to. In the meantime, thank you so much. We're honored that you're part of our 35th year in the sales training business. We have enjoyed every moment of it and are very excited about 35 more of them. In the meantime, I wish you all the best of luck and happy selling. I'm Jeb Brooks with the Brooks Group. Thanks so much.